Well, good afternoon if you are on the East Coast of the United States and parts South and Central and South America. Good morning if you're in points West. Good evening, especially to our loved ones in the United Kingdom tonight. Thinking of you. Good evening, buonasera to everybody in Pesaro, birthplace of the Grande Rossini. Special love, as always, to our friends and loved ones in Ukraine. We are with you. We support you. And greetings to people all around the world. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on IDAGIO, the place where classical music happens. IDAGIO is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. My guest today is someone who I first met. I remember exactly when and where I met him in the 1980s at the Metropolitan Opera. Will Crutchfield, who then was a music critic for the New York Times, but long ago left that profession and is now a conductor, musicologist, vocal coach, artistic and general director of Teatro Nuovo, founded in 2018. We'll talk about that. And was director of opera from 1997 to 2017 at Caramore. He is someone who is a thinking musician. I think I can say that in all fairness. Not that other musicians don't think, but there's great inquiry and study and thought and reflection in the work that Will does. And because a lot of what he does centers on bel canto, which is an area that I particularly adore, I'm very happy to talk to him. We haven't spoken that much in the years, but I've followed his work, his daughter's work a lot, Victoria, and therefore, Will, welcome very much.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. I think given the events of the world, today is September 9th, 2022, for a date stamp on this. It's important to put into context what happened yesterday in the world, namely the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And everybody was posting on social media. I decided not to post about this queen, but to post the overture to Rossini's opera Elisabetta Regina d'Inghilterra, Elizabeth, Queen of England. She was the first Queen of England. And so I will take any opportunity to revisit Rossini. And so I decided to go back and listen to that opera yesterday and study up a bit on its details that I knew. And I found a great deal that it foreshadows what I wanted to talk to you about and will talk to you about today, which is Rossini's opera Maometto il Secondo, Maometto Secondo. Namely, that Rossini, the fantastic Rossini, was resident in Naples and was basically the music director, the court composer, call it that, of the Teatro San Carlo and all the theaters of Naples. And he began there in 1813, 1814, really. And his first opera was Elisabetta Regina d'Inghilterra. It was a big hit. And the Queen of England, Elizabeth, was played by Isabella Colbran. And the Leicester, Generale delle Armi, General of the Armies, was Andrea Nozzari, a tenor. And by the way, the Norfolk was Manuel Garcia, No Shrinking Violet as a tenor. It had a remarkable cast. It was a huge hit. And Will Colbran and Nozzari were later in the premiere of Maometto il Secondo. And in effect, Rossini had, let's call it a stock company that he could work with of some of the greatest singers in the world in Naples. And he composed many roles for these artists and their particular gifts, and wrote music tailored to their abilities. And the last opera that these people did together was, in fact, Maometto Secondo. So in a way, it is the culmination of this artistic era that began with Elisabetta Regina d'Inghilterra. So am I on the right track?
I may be forgetting the sequence, but I thought Zelmira was the last and Maometto was the second to last, but I could be wrong.
Okay. We can look it up. That's the great thing about research.
There are nine of them, and they are really the most ambitious things Rossini ever wrote. The real direction they are leading is Guillaume Tell, which is, of course, his last opera, and is just this
In English, William Tell, for people who
William
know what
Tell.
that means. Yeah.
Yes, and it's just a feast of music, symphonic, vocal, choral, dance. It is sort of the summary of everything he had written. But what is really striking, compared to his other Paris operas, in my opinion, the line really goes through these Neapolitan operas and straight into William Tell. There's a fantastic buildup of architecture, his ability to fill out his habitual forms, his habitual riffs, and the way he wrote music from the very beginning of his career. He just got better and better at draping it out on long structures and long dramatic scenes, and filling it up with even more instrumental detail. And he did that without ever really changing his musical credo. He never really changed his idea of how a piece is put together. It's just that if it was like this, then it gets like this, and like this, and like this, maintaining this fantastic rhythmic energy and this fantastic sense of proportion. So there is something about a Rossini opera that just carries you along. And they are long in time, but if you perform them well, and if you perform them complete, or as near to complete as you can afford, we are doing it complete. If you perform them whole, they don't feel long. They feel like you have just been transported to this musical world, and you would love to stay there. The composer I would compare him to in that is Wagner.
Yes, I was about to say that there are people for whom Götterdämmerung goes by in seconds.
Yes, me too.
And whereas Meistersinger goes by in centuries for some people. But I know that's open to debate. But the thing is, I have said for decades, and people agree with me, that Rossini is the most maligned of the major composers. I find myself always defending him. And the discussion usually begins with the following way. I know you must be asked every day, what's your favorite opera? And I typically name 5 or 6 of my favorites. And then I say, and every note written by Rossini. And I mean that. I mean that. I am ecstatic when I listen to Rossini well performed. And not just the famous overtures, not just the crescendi, not just the things we associate with him, but the invention, the humor, the drama, the scope of human nature that he encompasses that we tend to forget because we think of him just for a couple of comedies and a couple of overtures. But he was not perfect. The more I study about him, he was apparently very parsimonious, and made his wife suffer for that. But in general, he strikes me as she had her side too, I know. That was Isabelle Colbran, by the way, the soprano for whom he composed many of these roles. But the thing is about him is that because he cultivated such a, let's call it a sociable lifestyle in Paris after he retired from composing, and ran a salon and was humorous and charming and loved his food. And he acquired that reputation, a sort of Falstaffian reputation, that people forget the rigor, the quality, the genius of his work.
I hope that has changed. I mean, I think what you are describing there was an attitude towards Rossini that lasted for a long time because he was so popular. And there was a period in the 1820s when his operas accounted for about 75 to 80% of the repertory in Italy. I mean, that's how dominant he was. And it wasn't quite that high, but it was pretty high, probably over 50%, also in Vienna and London and in the Italian theater of Paris. And so he was so much the giant of opera that there, to make room for Wagner, to make room for Verdi, to make room for progress, people had to adopt an attitude of hyper criticism against his achievements. And that lasted for a while because the operas were obstinately popular, and in a way you had to fight against Semiramide to get a chance to put on Götterdämmerung, and so that attitude was bequeathed to the 20th century. But surely it's gone by now. Surely, after all these years of Pesaro, after all these revivals of works that are not just another Barber of Seville, after all these chances to get to know scores like William Tell, I hope it's true. And after the devotion of major figures like Callas and Sutherland and Marilyn Horne, and Philip Gossett in the scholarly world, and Claudio Abbado and Riccardo Chailly in the conducting world,
And
surely we
Alberto
are now.
Zedda.
And Zedda lived on Rossini. I mean,
Yeah.
he breathed Rossini. But in naming those others, I'm talking about people who had the whole breadth of the repertory at their disposal, and found it important to do Rossini. So I think we can say that this battle has been won in the broader musical world, that we do now consider Rossini one of the great geniuses, as he truly was. And I think the next challenge is to come to a sort of a third wave of performing Rossini,
Well, I
because
do want to get to that, but I just want to push back a
sure,
little bit on what you said. I would say that the change happened where his restoration began in the late 1970s, because while artists such as Callas and Sutherland did certain things before, Sutherland did a famous Semiramide, Callas did Il Turco in Italia, um, it took more, and it took the movement of the 70s, especially Marilyn Horne and Philip Gossett, and also Claudio Abbado, and then the foundation of the Rossini Festival in Pesaro in the early 1980s. I was very fortunate to be someone working on the very first production they did there, Il Viaggio a Reims, which was conducted by Claudio Abbado, directed by Luca Ronconi. Alberto Zedda was, in effect, the house musicologist, in addition to being a great conductor of Pesaro, and they began the tradition gradually of doing what are called critical editions, and I want to talk to you about that a bit later. But it was his first explosively successful revival of a lost opera, Il Viaggio a Reims, with Katia Ricciarelli, Samuel Ramey, Ruggero Raimondi, huge Lela Kuberle, a huge, fantastic cast with a great production, and Abbado being a splendid conductor and advocate for it. And that's what started things. And then the motivation, I think, of the people of the city of Pesaro to honor Il Cigno di Pesaro, the Swan of Pesaro, as Rossini was known. He was from there. To begin to make that happen. And then a new generation of singers who came along who could sing this, and conductors who could conduct it, and the development of critical editions. But we Rossinians are saddled with the fact that reviews written in the 1950s or the 1920s or the 1890s that belittled Rossini, people can still read these if they do, and the people who tend to read them tend to be people with scholarly ambitions, let's call it that, who just regurgitate this older stuff without really looking afresh at what Rossini created.
yeah.
And
But does anybody
yeah,
really read those regurgitators?
yes, unfortunately, they're thrown back to me all the time,
Okay.
unfortunately, and I have to rebut them. I choose to rebut them. I don't have to. I choose to rebut them because I just think they're completely wrong. And to me, Rossini is just my hero as a man is Giuseppe Verdi. My favorite composer for his operas is Gioacchino Rossini.
I would never dare to name a favorite anything, but
I
I
know, but
would
as I
say,
said, every note written by Rossini.
um,
Obviously, I
well,
love all across the four centuries of opera.
but here's something though that might be encouraging to you and to your viewers here. I spend most of my time dealing with musicians, singers, and orchestra players who are from about 20 to their early 30s, or a little beyond. But I mean, most of my time is spent dealing with this younger generation. The accomplishments of Pesaro, the accomplishments of Gossett, of Marilyn Horne, of Callis and Sutherland, of the baby steps, and then the big crescendo of critical editions and so forth. All that was established before they were born. All that was established before they began to receive their musical education. They don't have any trouble thinking of Rossini as a great composer. They love it. They don't condescend to it. They are eager to dig in and to discover more, and to discover more about how we might get the performing style refined and established for the operas that don't have a pre-existing tradition. And that's a big practical issue. When people get together and start rehearsing a score, you've got the notes in front of you, you've got whatever you may have been taught about interpretation, because you have to do a lot of things that aren't in the plain notes. It wasn't yet the time of Stravinsky when everything is written on the page. You have to know a lot, and you have to learn a lot in order to interpret them. And that is where we're sort of entering into a next wave of performing skill and performance style. But the eagerness for it, the love of it, is absolutely there. There is no battle anymore. And I would compare that even to when I got into opera when I was a kid. I started very early because I was like singing in the children's chorus of Carmen when I was only 8. So I've been around opera for a long time. And even compared to then, the difference is enormous. When I started teaching singers to do ornamentation, for instance, at Juilliard back in the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, I taught some classes in improvisation and performance practice, and talking to the string players about sliding on the string, portamento we call it, things like that. They were still kind of scared. Now they are not scared. Now in 2022, they are eager. And I find that thrilling.
You've said some terms that I wanted to get into, so we'll do it now. Would you define ornamentation?
Ornamentation is, in all the arts that use that term, the addition of something that is thought of as decorative or optional to something else that is considered structural and basic. So that is true in architecture, that's true in painting, and it's the same thing in music. You have, and this is something that musicians have to understand through experience and study in order to get the feel of where it's right. But you have the lines written by the composer, which may already have some ornamental elements, but they always have an underlying structural element, and you can learn to see what that is. And then, if other pitches occur to your brain that sound right with the ones on the page, or other rhythms occur to your musical mind that cohere with the ones given, in the periods of music when ornamentation was part of performance, you let yourself go into that fantasy. You are a kind of co-composer. And all soloists in Rossini's time were co-composers. That goes for playing a concerto, that goes for an oboe solo in the middle of an overture, and that goes for singers.
So add the word cadenza. Where does a cadenza fit into this concept?
Cadenza means cadence. In Italian, we in English use the Italian word cadenza to mean the ornamental thing that you might do. at the harmonic event that is called a cadence. That is a resolution to the final tonic, the keynote of a piece. And it's kind of revealing that in Italian it's the same word, because the word really means the harmonic thing, but it can also be used as a shorthand for what the soloist might do when that harmonic moment comes. And there was a very long tradition, hundreds of years, of the ornamentation increases at the cadence, even to the point where the orchestra can completely stop and the singer can do a completely invented passage without accompaniment, leading back in. And you have to know how, with the voice, to show the orchestra when it's time to play again. And, it was like jazz. To be a performer is to be a composer, and it is to have in your own head a mastery of the basic musical materials. To be a good Rossini singer, you've got to know what sounds like a cadence and what sounds like a departure. You have to have a feel for what kind of line needs to be left plain and what kind of line is an invitation to use your own imagination. And these things are not laws, they're not rules. They're a language. You have to learn it like a language. And as you get comfortable, you can speak it. And it is just like learning a language in real life. At first, you have to really focus on the rules of the grammar and put together your vocabulary bit by bit. But eventually, you turn a corner and you can just talk. And that's what we want to find in Rossini singers.
I love the expression you use, to be a performer is to be a composer. That would really take us back to Orpheus. And Orpheus being the subject of many operas, also among the first, one of them being by Monteverdi in 1607. But I think that I'm not one of them, but I think that there are conductors, composers, and music lovers who would push back at this concept a lot, saying that you have to do come scritto, as written. And let's say Riccardo Muti is often an advocate of that you want to do what is written in the score, to which I would only add, and that let you take over, that sometimes there are multiple versions of a score.
There are sometimes multiple versions of the score, but let's just pause on Maestro Muti for a moment. I mean, he is a brilliant, inspired, wonderful musician, but he does not understand the history of Italian music. And he is trapped in a view of interpretation that was actually kind of new with his generation. When, think about this. If you look back before the Second World War, the idea of a conductor who wasn't also a composer didn't exist. I mean, Toscanini was the first to be a famous conductor who didn't try to add works of his own to the repertory. He did, actually, very young, but he realized that he could do more of what he wanted to do if he just propagandized for the music of others and didn't try to put himself forward as a composer, which gave him an extra kind of authority. He could be the representative of Beethoven instead of putting himself on the line by saying, here is the music of Toscanini. But before that, there was no such thing. Conductor, that meant Wagner, composer. Mahler, composer. Richard Strauss, composer. And so the idea of the non-composing conductor, who is the strict guardian of the holy score written by these great masters, that is a power play. It is a way to give that person authority without vulnerability. And I think it has been bad for the world of music.
One thing I'll add to that, and I embrace what you say, Will, is that until very recently at music conservatories in Italy, it was required of any man or woman who wanted to become a conductor that he or she had to study composition.
Of course.
That is no longer the case.
I think it's still the case. They may skip over it a little bit. They may
not require. I know this because young conductor friends of mine who study in Italy lament that.
Okay.
And I've heard this many, many times.
But
they regret. I mean, I know conductors in their late 30s who feel they were the last ones who benefited from having to study composition. as part of their studies to become conductors?
Well, if the young conductors aren't studying composition, they're idiots because you can't, you are crippled if you don't understand how the piece was put together. However, I would say studying composition is something that a smart, well trained musician can do out of class. You don't have to have a teacher for it. If you are sufficiently equipped musically, when you study scores, you are studying composition. If you fail to track the harmonies and the voice leading and the proportions of structure of a score, I mean, to study those things is to study composition, and to fail to study them is just dancing in front of the orchestra. So I have a feeling. I mean, I know a lot of young conductors too, and I don't notice them failing to understand how the piece is put together.
I mean, specifically in Italy, I'm talking about, not the world.
Okay.
I'm just talking about in Italian conservatories.
Okay. Well, the Italian conservatories have been in trouble for a long time. Italy has been in trouble for a long time. Look at the number of. I mean, if you look at our profession, 70% of professional performances of opera are accounted for by Germany, Austria, and the German-speaking part of Switzerland. Right there, you're already up to 70% of what is happening in our world. I do a lot of historical research on the singers of 100 and more years ago in Italy in particular. And I mean, Rome, Venice, Milan, Torino, all had at least two opera houses, sometimes three, in Naples and Milano, sometimes four, going at the same time with full seasons. And all the little towns that have not seen an opera in the 21st century had seasons. They had, they might be just two or three operas. It would be a company coming through and performing in Viareggio or in Piove di Sacco, and they would mount a season and go on to another. But when Italy had half the population it has today, it had almost 10 times the amount of opera it has today. I mean, that proportion change is drastic. It is.
There are many reasons for that. I would argue that one of them is television arrived in Italy in 1954. And a lot of the money from RAI, which is the national broadcaster, that may have funded radio orchestras before in Torino, in Milan, in Rome, in many places, went toward broadcasting of television. And now the RAI National Orchestra is in Torino, and there are not many RAI orchestras. James Conlon is the conductor. But in addition, Italians don't necessarily get musical education in their schools. I did a lot of my training in Italy, but I went as an American with the intention of doing that training and sought it out, and went to Bologna first and then Milan and Verona primarily, because I wanted to go to the places where Rossini and Mozart studied and start from there. But you could go through an entire education in Italy without touching music, unfortunately.
Well,
but for those who want it, it's there. And I mean, I think Italy still produces many fantastic conductors who we see all over the world. I've interviewed many of them. I've worked with some of them. And I think that Italy still punches above its weight in terms of producing conductors. In terms
Finland punches above its weight in producing conductors.
Pardon me?
Finland is the country.
Finland also. Oh, I agree. I've worked a lot in Finland. I am very passionate about Finland, so you don't have to persuade me on that. Finland, on everything relating to music, punches way above its weight. But that's because they have musical education in the schools. When I've gone to churches in Finland and I can see 7-year-olds sight sing, it's a whole other phenomenon from much of the rest of the world. But Finland is unique. But Finland is also a country of 5 million, not 60 million.
Yeah, early childhood education is the key to the future. There is no hope for classical music without the restoration of extensive musical training in childhood. That is a tough thing to say, but it is just, unfortunately, the truth. This is not a field that can survive on finding 27-year-olds and saying, hey, you might like this, give a listen. They can't. I mean, it's like adult illiteracy. It's like there are certain things that if they don't go in during childhood, maybe one time in a million they will go in afterwards, but one time in a million is just not good enough. And so for most people, what they get before they are 12, 13, 14, or at latest around that time, defines whether they're even going to be available later for the love of classical music. And I used to, for a while, I got very interested in this, and when people would come back after a concert to, say they liked it, if they did, or get an autograph on the program, and I would ask them, how did you get into music? And, sometimes they would say, oh, nothing, I just love it, I had no training. And at a certain point, I started probing a little farther because it didn't make sense to me. And what I found is that almost every single one who started by saying, oh, I never studied, I just love to listen, if pressed, they'll say, oh, yeah, I had 2 years of piano lessons, but I was terrible, I had no talent. Or, oh, I played flute in the band for a couple of years, but it was, I was really nothing special. Well, the difference between those 2 years in the band and those few years of piano lessons, the difference between that and nothing is like the difference between the coastal plain and Mount Everest. I mean, those bits of study in childhood, that's what makes it possible. We have to bring that back.
So you and I are Americans, so let's talk about our own country. How do we make early childhood education in music part of the curriculum?
The cynical answer is fund an experiment that will prove beyond any doubt that childhood music study raises SAT scores. Then all the soccer moms will be all over it. The
SAT being Scholastic Achievement Test in
Scholastic Aptitude Test.
Aptitude, thank you.
Scholastic Aptitude Test. Yeah. Those are the tests that American colleges use to rank admissions applicants, among other things, but they're very important. And my point is that since there is such an obsession with getting into a good school and adding to your credentials, even if they're all imagining people as future hedge fund managers, which is a soul-deadening idea that everybody wants to be that. I mean, good for the ones who do it, but gosh. The point is, though, if it is clear that a musical education is just as important as learning algebra or learning correct grammar or learning to speak various languages, all the things that are still in the curriculum, then music will have a chance. And it is that important. It is a part of a basic human education. There is no reason to say that learning trigonometry is more useful to future life than learning the rudiments of music. And I would like to emphasize, it doesn't even have to be classical music. In this country, in America, we have a lot of debate about valorizing dead white males and colonialism and looking for diversity and a different way of viewing history. That's all fine. I mean, people have their disagreements about it, but you can learn music on any kind of music. What is necessary is some kind of education that puts the child in the position of needing to produce the expected note at the correct moment. That basic operation is what opens up the ear and opens up the brain pathways and allows you to start to get a grip on music. And if you educate everybody in those basics, then the ones that have talent to go farther, you will find them. If you don't do that, you have, potential Yujia Wang growing up without ever touching a piano because you never found out that she was talented. And So that is the crucial thing. I mean, we're very far from opera here, but it is actually more
Well, not
important.
really. I think it's a fundamental part of it.
It is the fundamental part.
Yes, I have, I think I'm the author of Opera 101 and Classical Music 101. So a big part of my life is inspiring people to fall in love with these art forms. But therefore, I get invited to places to lead programs, but also to study what other people do. And I was in Finland, in fact, learning what the Finns do, and it's terrific. I will name two other programs I think are terrific. One of them is at the opera in Frankfurt, Germany, where they take very little children, 2 and 3 year olds, and expose them. They give them all recorders that they can blow into, and they have them walk around and touch pianos and speak to singers, and singers will sing to them. And when these children become very at home in that environment, they want to go back because to them it's play. But at the same time, you hear the musicians instilling chord progressions in their heads. You just see it happening without them knowing it, so that when they come back 6 or 7 years later, they have many more foundations than they ever would have expected to find in a 2 and 3 year old. That is the youngest I've ever seen. Another program
That
I
is the Lord's
witnessed
work.
was in Florence, Italy. I don't know if it's still going, but maybe 20 years ago at the Maggio Musicale in Florence, they had a program called Crescendo, which is a musical term, but it also just means growing. And they would bring children to the opera while their parents were attending the actual performance upstairs. We'd bring the kids down to the rehearsal room. And on a screen would be the opera that the parents were watching. And being Italy, they had what's called a merenda, a snack, and they had yogurts and they had very nice foods. And the kids got to eat while the music was playing.
Mhm.
And we would see which children went to the screen. And then I would be one of them. I would say, well, her name is Mimi, and her hands are cold, and her candle went out, and his name is Rodolfo, and he's a poet. And so on, just telling the basic story as people. And the music came second. And then we would have the parents come down at the intermission, and we'd say, your daughter, your son went to the screen and watched. For the kids who only ate yogurt, fine, no problem. But if we identified children who were drawn to the screen, we would then tell the parents about that. And 2 or 3 years later, the theater would provide a free ticket for the child to attend a performance with the parents at 9 years old, let's say. So it becomes a family activity. And the child, having seen it on the screen, is familiar enough with the art form, and he or she knows not to talk. And then at the intermission, we would give them a cappuccino and we would talk. And this discussion about the story, about the music, but not as a test, but what did you experience? I would ask the kid, and then they would talk about it with no right and wrong, just whatever they experienced. But we wanted to develop in them listening, focus, and all that. And we found that some of those children, when they went to college, would then get subscriptions or attend student performances, and they became the next generation of opera goers. And it takes sometimes that much time, but I think it's an essential activity. That's an investment that comes outside of the universities and schools where we would teach kids musicology. But I think it's just as important because sometimes, as in Florence, the kids self-identify their interest, and then we capture them, so to speak. So let's go back to our friend Rossini. Um, Something that happened in many of his operas, and certainly in Elisabetta Regina d'Inghilterra and Maometto II, that you will be doing, is that there were two people in the orchestra pit working together or maybe not together. One of them was called primo violino e capo d'orchestra, in other words, first violin and head of the orchestra. And the other one is maestro al cembalo. And typically the maestro al cembalo at the keyboard was Rossini at these performances. And then there was a first violinist who was also described as head of the orchestra. When I saw you work in, I believe, in Caramore and certainly at Teatro Nuovo, you had that structure.
Not at Caramore.
Okay, not in Caramore, just Teatro
This is
Nuovo.
something, I mean, I think we are the first people to do this anywhere for romantic opera in modern times. The direction of an opera was a very fluid thing in those days. There were generally those two people. They had many different terms. Sometimes the maestro al cembalo was also called direttore della musica. Sometimes the primo violino was capo d'orchestra, sometimes direttore d'orchestra. And there was lively jockeying between them, and there are a lot of things we still don't know about just who was in charge, in which cities, in which theaters. There was a kind of, creative struggle going on that eventually resolved itself in favor of a single conductor, the modern conductor. And as music got more complicated, that became more necessary. But here's the fascinating thing. That moment came in France and Germany and England, basically over the period 1815 to 1830. That was the transition to having conductors waving a baton or their hands, as opposed to a player in the group leading while playing. So 1815 to 1830 in the rest of Europe. In Italy, it wasn't established until the 1860s. 2 generations later, the world premiere of Un ballo in maschera had no conductor. The premiere of La Traviata, Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, no conductor. We find Verdi writing as late as the beginning of the 1870s to Ricordi, his publisher, saying, for my new operas, you should rent them only to theaters that use a conductor. Meaning Aida, La Forza del Destino, and Don
Cello
Carlo.
and Falstaff.
No, those weren't written yet. This is
Okay.
just after Aida was new. But the point is, even at that moment, some of the smaller theaters still didn't do it. So what fascinated me is, what were they getting out of this older system that they were so reluctant to let it go? They held on to it for years. And I think one thing, it testifies to an idea that there is not a person interpreting the score. The score is interpreting itself through the energies and musicalities of many different people understanding it in their own way and doing their own job. The maestro al cembalo, the principal job was getting the singers into a condition to perform the opera, helping the ones that needed musical help, governing the ensembles where they had to listen to each other in case they weren't, in other words, there were bosses, but there were bosses of small parts of the big machine, not a big boss controlling the whole machine. And when you ask me for recordings that we might send people to, one of them I recommend. This might seem like not opera, but it is exactly on this topic. Cortot, Thibault, and Casals, violin, cello, and piano, recording the Schubert trio in B flat. Really, all of the recordings show this, but I would single out especially the first movement of the Schubert B flat trio. I was fascinated with that recording from childhood because they don't sound like they're trying to make a unity. They sound like 3 people talking to each other. Thibault and Casals both rush their scale passages, but in different ways. Thibault and Cortot both rush. Casals doesn't rush. Casals is more pulling the tempo back at times. They don't go for unity. They go for expression and conversation. And I think unity in interpretation is overrated. And even togetherness in ensemble is overrated. Compared to what we tend to lose is the individual character and impulse of the musician making a line of music. And it took a long time for the conductors to take over completely, but by the time they finally did, people looked around themselves and realized singing has become very boring. And I think we can bring back a lot of life to these older works that depended so much on improvisation and depended on the personalities of the individual protagonists by dispersing the control. Now, that brings a difficulty because, they lived their whole lives in Rossini style. They didn't have to learn it. It was just there. They were more like jazz musicians. They spent their whole lives in that one musical idiom, and they got really good at it, and they did what they did. Now we are in effect museum curators. We are dealing with something that is from a long, long time ago, and so we have to study and immerse ourselves. But it's worth that effort. I mean, one thing I'm very proud of with Teatro Nuovo is that all the reviews have said some version of, it sounded so spontaneous, it sounded so fresh, it sounded remarkably unlike the usual bel canto orchestra or the usual bel canto performance. We have a long way to go to get where I think we might go, but there's no way to go down that path without taking the first steps. So I find it just thrilling that we're able to do this. We lost our performances this past summer because of a damn COVID outbreak that just swept through the company. We had no choice but to cancel. But we are bringing them back as fast as we can. November 2 in New York City, we're going to do Mametto Secondo that you mentioned before. We're flying our orchestra back in from all over the world, a period instrument orchestra. And the music directors are Jacob Lehmann, who is the primo violino, and Lucy Tucker Yates, who is we use the masculine term maestro al cembalo because maestra in Italian today means kindergarten teacher.
Teacher, yeah.
They are the musical leaders, and I hope everybody who can be in New York on November 2 will come to this, because it is, to me, listening, it's just a complete thrill to hear this big musical structure of Rossini allowed to fly the way it can fly.
And
Teatro.
Teatro, yes, Nuovo, Nuovo .org. .org. And it will be at the Rose Theater, which people know is a wonderful theater in the Time Warner Center, though it's part of the Lincoln Center family of theaters. And it's a wonderful place to do and see opera. And Will, maybe you haven't decided this yet, but that space has a wonderful place for chorus if you want it. Have you decided where to put the chorus yet?
We have several operas planned for that theater, and we are doing different things with the chorus in different operas. But let me leave that as a bit of suspense for the moment, because
okay.
There are other plans coming. We'll be back there on a regular basis. Let's just say. So
I'm asked a question a lot, and I want to ask you this question. Operas from that era and before, including Mozart, Den Führung aus dem Sarai, the abduction from the Seraglio, but also in a strange way, Die Zauberflöte, the magic flute, but certainly operas by Rossini, such as Il Turco in Italian, the Turk in Italy, L'Italiana in Algeria, the Italian girl in Algiers, and Maometto Secondo, Mehmet or Mohammed II, and Rossini's Otello and Verdi's Otello have Muslim characters. And they're not, quote, bad guys or good guys or whatever. They're complex characters, the way opera characters are. And there is a lot of discussion about how these are to be represented. And I'm not talking about makeup. I'm talking about the dramatic choices that are made in presenting these characters. Are we to present them in their time and place of the opera, or are we to try to be sensitive to the issues of now?
I think that if you don't believe you can be sensitive to the issues of now by performing these works in the context they were conceived, then you have a very primitive and limited view of art. I think it is absolutely, the only way it looks wrong or colonialist or racist or any of those things to perform these works with their original stories as originally understood is to understand them at the classics illustrated level and not at the line by line, note by note, thought by thought level. Art is complex, as life is. Sloganeering is never the whole story. It is not the whole story in the old days when there might have been slogans that implied that Christianity should triumph everywhere and Islam should be overthrown. That is a soundbite. That's a slogan. None of these things operates at such a simplistic level as that. And today, when it is also slogan to say, okay, America is founded on systemic racism. Well, there is some truth behind that, but if that is the only soundbite you can analyze things through, you're not seeing much. And so I am strongly against reductive, simplistic interpretations of operas and drama in general. And I would point out that in the particular case you bring up, the military conflict, rising and falling military conflict between Western Europe, principally Christian, though having its own divisions after the Protestant Reformation and the various schisms before that, but principally Christian Western Europe and principally Muslim, what we now call the Middle East, but what was mostly dominated by the Ottoman Empire. That struggle was a big part of history for centuries. Of course, there is drama about it. If you notice what the more successful and imaginative dramatists were doing with it is exactly what you hinted at. They are making them humans. They are not presenting a caricature Islam. They are not presenting caricature Turks. They are presenting characters that might speak to an audience that is inclined towards prejudice and tell them they're not so right to be prejudiced. That behind the symbols of Christianity here, Islam there, Western Europe here, Southern Europe there, whatever, black here, white there, behind these stereotypes are human beings. And that is erased from opera if you smear onto it a big critique of the 18th century, or a big critique of the era of slavery, or a big critique of the era when women couldn't vote. And all of those things were true. And it is progress that we have come away from all of those things. But if you smear a big poster about the old days were very evil, and you push that onto a work of art from the past, you will never understand that work. So, I mean, I'm speaking here, I'm an unashamed liberal Democrat, and I donate to Senate campaigns, the progressive politicians' campaigns, but I am embarrassed of my fellow leftist Democrats when they start putting these poster-like caricatures on old art.
I think it's 2016, when there were the killings of editors at the magazine Charlie Hebdo, I think it was called, in Paris, for what their ideas were or the way they depicted certain things. I was working at the Paris Opera, not on the production I'm about to address. Someone else was doing Mozart's Die Entführung aus dem Serail, the abduction from the Seraglio. And it starred Lisette Oropesa. And the production was brilliant. I wish I could take any credit for it, because what they did was they decided to take the musicians out of the orchestra pit and seat them at the sides of the stage, just have a conductor in the pit, and dress them in the costumes of the instruments or the music that they played. And therefore you had Islamic, Muslim, you had Christian, maybe perhaps Jewish characters in the orchestra. And they didn't enact these, they simply were dressed that way so that the audience would see these people as equals seated on the stage, at the sides of the stage. And in the middle, the action was played out. And the music very specifically was used to narrate the subtle social and religious and sexual differences among the characters without commentary. And to me, it was brilliant because they addressed the issue that Paris was riven with at the moment, and there was still a lot of tension about would there be more killings. But it was one of the most wonderful examples I've ever seen of art addressing society, but without screaming it. They simply did it,
Sounds
and
good.
it was fantastic. Um, you used a term a half hour ago that I certainly know, but I'd like you to define it two terms for our audience: performance practice and period instrument orchestra.
Performance practice, Aufführungspraxis, the term was invented in Germany, and it means studying the way music was performed in its era. There are a lot of things in music, phrasing, the relative length of notes, the where you think you should make a retard, slow down the music, where you think you should speed it up, that are not in the printed music. They are part of style. Performance practice is a word for what used to be called style, and style is something that you learned from hearing the good people do it, or imitating your teacher, or getting an idea from great musicians of their habits. But it became interesting to academia when people began to realize that it was not just one continuous flow through the history of music. It had been different at different times and places, and some of the music that we still do, say Mozart, say Rossini, was performed very differently at the time. And so when this is all a kind of a side product of the modern world giving up on modern classical music. Movies came, pop music came, the Beatles came, Elvis came. At a certain point in the progress of the 20th century, music for symphony orchestra and opera houses had a true crisis and no longer really had a wide public. It was something that you took like medicine because it was your duty. And at that point, a lot of classical musicians, even if they didn't think they were rebelling against that, it's inseparable from that. They started looking at the past in a different way because we found ourselves in a position where this glorious past of our art form is endlessly fascinating. It gives us music that we love, that we want to hear again every year until we die. It gives us thousands of pieces that we want to discover that we haven't yet heard. And it comes with all this interesting history. What was a violin like in 1800? What was it like in 1700? What kind of flute did they play? What did the timpani sound like? And so the whole original instrument movement came from fascination with, it sounds very different. It's not an ethical matter. There's no obligation to use the sounds that they heard in Mozart's day. But if you've got a curious ear, it's awfully fascinating. It's great fun. It's a kind of play. And sometimes you realize things. One thing we realized with Teatro Nuovo, we followed a seating plan from the Teatro San Carlo that you were just talking about before, showing where the violas were, where the cellos were, where the cembalo, the keyboard was, and so on. And we just did it because let's find out. Let's find out how that sounds. It's very different from a modern orchestra pit. For one thing, the cellos, basses, and violas are split on the two sides. They can't really play together like a section. They are interacting with the violinists and wind players closest to them. Well, the first time we did that, it was Tancredi, and I was the cembalo maestro for that production. I do about half of them, and other people do half of them. And I walked back to listen to the balance. I had to bite my lips to keep from crying because I thought, okay, I have conducted Rossini for 25 years, and only now today do I understand his viola parts. Here's why. Usually in a symphony orchestra or an opera orchestra in the pit, you clump the violas together in the middle of the orchestra. And they are in Rossini usually sustaining long notes, just sustaining the harmony. And when they are bunched together in the middle of the orchestra, you don't really hear them, you just sort of sense them as a kind of glue holding the sound together. When they're over at the sides, where they were in Rossini's orchestra pit, you hear them very clearly all through the hall, and it's like this gorgeous halo around the music instead of this sort of gunky glue in the middle of the music. And who would have known? I had no idea. I
And
had
would
no
it have been
idea.
Rossini who did that distribution of the players?
Yes, I mean, it was from the period of Rossini's music directorate.
I
Whether
mean,
he,
as opposed to the first violinist.
probably not, because everybody respected each other and did their job. Rossini, the first violinist in Naples was Festa, and there's accounts of Rossini rehearsing with him. Rossini didn't do much leading in the performance. He sat there listening at the piano, presumably, playing along harmonies as one did in those days, and relied completely on Festa to lead the band. And then at the end of the rehearsal, he would go around player by player and make his comments to them. And Festa was something like 20 years older than Rossini, so he was kind of the senior partner in that collaboration. So we don't know whether he designed the pit plan or Rossini did. It's also a pretty common arrangement. I mean, you can see other pit plans around Italy. But my point is, if you don't try stuff like that, there are secrets you will never discover. And so we have been on a real voyage of discovery. And in Maometto, we're going to have a stage band, a real band on the stage, including Turkish percussion that represents Maometto's soldiers. And that's another thing you rarely see. In operas that have a band, it's usually put off stage or it's played
Yes.
from inside the orchestra pit. But when you have it on the stage, that's what was done at the time, and that's a different matter.
It remind me, because it's been a while since I saw this. Is this the opera with the cannons?
It has a cannon, yeah.
Yeah.
We don't have, we are not firing off a real live cannon in.
Because as I recall, Mehmet Maometto, just a tiny background on me. I was a Venetian history major with the belief that if I studied Venice, I could build my roots in opera. But while doing that, I was a teaching assistant for a professor of Ottoman history whose name was Kamal Karpat. So I had the unique advantage of majoring in Venetian history, but studying with a Turkish or Ottoman history teacher. So therefore, the War of the Janissaries, all these wars between Venice and the Ottomans, I learned both sides. And
Great.
he always spoke to me about the cannons in the introduction in Constantinople, later Istanbul, of the cannon as an instrument of war.
Yeah,
That's a strange term, instrument of war, but you know what I mean.
yeah.
Yeah,
Our guy Mehmet, he is the one who conquered Constantinople for the Ottoman Empire,
right.
and these amazing cannon were that was one of the main things he had that the Western armies didn't have.
So how do you make a cannon sound? Would you use the drums, or what do you?
You have to come to find out. We have a
Okay.
very, very creative percussionist.
Okay. Um, because I want to be mindful of time, and there's so much I want to ask you. In the case of Maometto Secondo, it premiered in Naples in 1820. It had another production in Venice at La Fenice in 1822, with changes to the story and to the music, therefore. And it had another version in Paris in 1826. So, is there a definitive score when you, as the conductor and as the maestro and the musicologist, take all of these different elements that you find? How do you determine, to go back to the concept of critical edition, means that a scholar and a musicologist have created what they determine that to be? Alberto Zedda in Pesaro did that for many, many years, and I got to work with him a bit on Il Turco in Italia. But when you have three different versions of this opera, how do you, Will Crutchfield, determine what is the performing score you're going to use?
It is a case by case choice. The whole idea of a critical edition, it simply means assembling the sources of a work, and this is true whether it's the Bible or a play of Shakespeare or an Italian opera. It is assembling the sources, looking at them critically, trying to determine, who did this, who did that, how old is this one, how old is that one, which one is a copy of which other one, just sort of sorting out the evidence that lies behind a work. And then, depending on what you find from that process, you may be able to say, okay, this is the original version and this is the author's revision from 6 years later. So we have two basic texts here and we can print them with all our annotations showing how we made our decisions, etc. In other cases, the situation is much more confused. The original version may have been lost. I mean, the one I did for Pesaro Aureliano in Palmira, the original manuscript of Rossini has gone missing. And so everything is guesswork about, and we can tell that there were sort of, very broadly speaking, two versions. The second one mostly abbreviation of the first one, but not just abbreviation. And we cannot say exactly which one was performed on the opening night. We cannot say exactly which one went to the next city. So sometimes there is real doubt. In the case of Maometto, it's pretty clear. And what we are doing is the original 1820 Naples version.
So the ending is different from the Venice version?
It is.
I don't want to give away the ending, but yeah.
It's okay. In opera, you know the ending before it starts. Mehmet and his troops overrun the tombs where the women are hiding, and Anna, his beloved, kills herself rather than submit to him because she is a patriot. And that ending, being shocking and tragic and violent, was a novelty in opera. Rossini was the guy who really turned the key towards tragic endings for serious operas. And not many. In all of Rossini's operas, there's like three. But they are very important three. Semiramide, Maometto II, Otello, that have a true tragedy. By the time of Verdi, almost all of the serious operas end with death and violence. But for Rossini, it was still a new thing, and in Venice, they were not ready for that. They didn't want that. So in Venice, there is a reconciliation. The Ottomans are defeated, and Anna marries a Venetian hero.
But also because Anna, the character, is a Venetian.
Yes, she is Venetian. Yeah.
That's the way Desdemona is a Venetian. It's interesting how local these get.
Well,
Venice. It's interesting. I mean, I'm not judging, but I just find it interesting, especially because Venice had censors at that time, as did many Italian theaters.
Yep.
And therefore they had to work around it. Rossini dealt with that. Verdi famously dealt with that.
Yep.
So going back to the notion of ornamentation, if you in 2022 are producing Maometto II and you have done all the research you've done into the different editions, you have read scores, you probably looked at scores done in recent productions like the one I saw in Toronto, you may know of recordings of individual arias going further back. But before about 1920, we don't have documentation of a performance apart from the original scores that you find, but you may not, as you described so well, we may not know about the ornamentation and cadenzas that Isabella Colbran or Andrea Nozzari did when the opera premiered in 1820. So
we do know. We
do know.
Not what they did in this opera, but we do have traces of their ornamentation. In Nozzari's case, and this is something I've been working on for years and years, finding this evidence in libraries and obscure publications and so on. They knew how to put a pen in their hand and write these things down, most of them, even if they also improvised it out of their heads without writing it down. They could write it down and sometimes did. In the case of Nozzari, an important composer named Antoine Reicha, who was a teacher, a famous teacher of composition as well, wrote a book called Treatise on Melody, and he presents in it three Italian arias elaborately ornamented. He doesn't say by whom, but another of his pupils borrowed some of that for yet another book that was published in Baltimore, of all places, in 1814, and he names the singer, Nozzari. We have some of Colbrand's ornament. In other words, this stuff is there, but it takes a lot of searching to find. And the way you go about ornamenting something like Maometto Secondo is you play and sing and study the examples that exist from the time until it starts to seem, comes back to what I said, like a language. And until it starts to get to the point where you can say, okay, now I know this language well enough to ask my way to the train station. Now I know it well enough to order in a restaurant. Now I know it well enough to have an argument about politics. Okay, that's a big step ahead. And now I know it well enough to write an essay, a historical essay, or give a television interview. In other words, these are all stages of learning a language. And that's what we're trying to push forward. There's a long way to go before we are at the point where all singers can speak that language well enough to just let themselves go and do it on their own. But we're working towards that day.
If you have created a score, let's take an aria sung by Anna in this opera, where you've decided basically how Colbrand may have done it. Do you then look for a soprano today who can do that? Or do you look for a soprano today who can create her own ornamentation that shows her off well?
Either. Both are valid. Both are valid because it's all putting together. It's a big game, but a serious game. All of those things are possible. In our particular case, we looked for someone of a similar range. One thing that is striking is later in opera, we got this really distinct soprano, mezzo, tenor, baritone, bass. But in Rossini's time, the ranges were closer together. And in this particular opera, the role of Anna and the role of Calbo, the contralto, who is the Venetian soldier that she is supposed to marry, they are almost the same range. I mean, the Colbrand part is a little bit higher. So that does influence the casting choice, but it doesn't mean that you can't ornament things in each singer's own way. It means that you try to learn enough of the context. See, if you're just reproducing somebody else's ornaments, that's not really ornamenting. That's just a secondary text, So and most singers quite legitimately have to do that. We are trying to take the baby steps towards the day when no singer has to do that because they have all learned the whole language. And so our ornaments are always a collaboration between maybe my ideas, maybe Jakob Lehmann's ideas, maybe Lucy Yates's ideas, maybe the singer's ideas, and we try this and that and critique, and in the end, the singer who is singing the role is the final decider, which is as it has to be, because they're the ones who have to stand up there and protagonize. And to the extent I can, I like to push it towards the singer's responsibility because that's where it's going to come off best.
And then after a Teatro Nuovo performance, in this case of Maometto Secondo, is the score put in its final shape as performed that night? Do you record it? In other words,
we make
let's say that a singer chooses to do an ornamentation that may not have been what was written down, but in the night, in the moment, she has a creative impulse and goes elsewhere with it. Ultimately, what will be published as a document of that night? Will it be a recording? Will it be, how do you document?
Is the CD dead? or is it going to be reborn? Who knows? I mean, probably it will live on as some kind of streaming on demand. I don't know.
Yeah.
If you're asking, do we then go back afterwards and write it down? No. What
Okay.
happened happened.
That was what I was asking. Because I mean, as you said so well, opera evolves. Each performance is different from every other previous performance of an opera that has the same name, because of production, cast, conductors, audience, all theater it's in, all those reasons. But you're doing such a Herculean effort, all of you, to make this distinct and honor performance practice, period instrumentation, all of that, that I'm someone who's very into documentation because I like to know what has been achieved so that the scholars of 100 years from now can go back and see what you did in 2022 and what Rossini did in Venice in 1822.
Let me tell you something. The scholars 100 years from now, when they study 2022, they are not going to be studying opera revivals. They're going to be studying hip hop. The study of opera is 100 years from now, they will study 1822. 200 years from now, they will study 1822. 300, and in my opinion, that's how it should be, because of course everything evolves, and we make it, if we're all trying to do what we think is the composer's voice, but we are doing it in 1912, we come up with one result. If we're doing it in 2012, we come up with another result. If we do it in 2112, we will come up with yet another result, because human beings are different and their cultural influences are different and their education is different. But that's part of the fun. That is part of the pleasure. It's not like there is a final destination here, which is we perfectly recreate the moment of Maometto at the San Carlo. We will never, and we can never. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, because in the trying is the stimulation and experimentation and creativity.
Don't forget that Alban Berg in the 1920s had hop hop in Wozzeck well before we had hip hop, which to me just sounds orthopedic. I don't get it. But I disagree with you. I think that the kind of scholarship and the resources that people have 100 years from now will enable them to easily study what you did today and compare it to what was done 200 years before. And I'm hopeful anyone watching us now 100 years from now will understand and make the effort to do that. There's so much more I could ask you about. Is there any particular thing that you think I left out that I should have asked you?
Well, I have one thing to say, that a recommendation to IDAGIO. Get more historical recordings on the site. Pre-1925 recordings. Not everybody is used to listening to them, but they are so informative. They let us know how music was done. You know, we can hear singers who worked with Verdi. We can't get all the way back to Rossini, but we can hear the singers who worked with Verdi and Gounod and Brahms and Mascagni and people like that. And some of them are so strikingly different from the way my generation was taught by our teachers to make music, that they're really more important than the new recordings, simply because they can teach us something. We all know how people do music right now, but how did they do it back when nobody had ever seen a movie, or nobody had ever heard a microphone, or nobody had ever heard rock and roll? That is, to me, that has been an inspiration all my life, because there is a vitality and a variety and a creativity in the classical world that later got rather starchy and square, and everybody be silent until the last notes of the last movement die away. And back then they were applauding the second movement and asking for a repeat of it, and it was alive in a way that has now gone over to the pop music world. And I would like for us in classical to claw some of that back, to claim some of that back. And it means loosening up in a lot of ways in our performing habits, It means the concert hall is not a church. And it means, but it also means studying and informing ourselves, because there is no way to get the feel of this stuff without investigating. So Fernando de Lucia, Mattia Battistini, Luisa Tetrazzini, all of these magic names from the 1890s and 1900s. I think it would be great if IDAGIO got some of those into circulation again.
I know who to send your comment to, and I will do that.
Great.
It's interesting you mentioned this, and I just realized this year, this summer, marks 50 years that I work in opera professionally. I began as a teenager. You and I are the same age. And I knew even then to look for the very old people. And so whether it was in New York, my first company was Lyric Opera Chicago, and then a number of Italian companies, and then the Met. But in Italy, I would seek out people who worked with Puccini and Mascagni, and there were many. And I was able to learn directly from them, from artists who may have worked with Cilea, and all of these names that we know sort of on the periphery, apart from Puccini, who were very much alive. I met many, many people who knew Toscanini simply because I asked. My main teacher in Italy was Tito Gobi, and he sent me to all kinds of people, you know, è molto anziana ma si ricorda. In other words, she's very old, but she remembers everything. And I met people who, you know, even a couple who worked with Verdi very, very late in their career. Yeah, because they were very young and in choruses. And it's not that Verdi, when it was a production, was new, but in the 1890s, when Verdi would go to Genoa specifically to remount a production or come meet the cast, I met people in the early 1970s who had been in those choruses as, say, 20-year-olds or 18-year-olds. They were old. They were in their 90s. They were in their 90s. And so it happened. So therefore, that's why I said to you that I'm very into documentation. Same when I do my food writing, I would look for the oldest people in towns and talk to them about agriculture 100 years ago, because we're talking 50 years ago I began doing this. And I learned things that modern cooks and food writers don't know because they don't ask.
Right.
So I'm very into it. And that's why today is my 125th presentation for Adagio. And I really wanted you, because I wanted today to be deep music. I've had guests who love music, who do things in music, but I really wanted today, because I love Rossini and your work is so wonderful to me, that I wanted to go way deep on these topics. And I appreciate it because you have helped me do that and educated my audience. And we have documented something that people will see 100 years from now. So Will Crutchfield, thank you very much. Teatro Nuovo.org, November 2nd, Rose Theater in the Time Warner Center on Columbus Circle at Lincoln Center, technically Lincoln Center, but not. Maometto Secondo. Grazie infinite. Thank you very, very much, Will Crutchfield.